Welcome, everyone. My name is Kevin Organichek, and I'm the CEO of Learnfully, and I'm joined by Robin Sadie. And today we're going to talk about SAT and ACT accommodations. Uh, Learnfully has been around for about 5 years, and we've worked primarily with neurodivergent students. And this year, we're hoping to bring a lot of I guess we'd like to reduce the anxiety around standardized test preparation for the same group of students who generally can perform really, really well on high stakes tests. So the order of things today, we'll talk a little bit about me and Robin. We will talk about ACT and SAT accommodations. We have a series of questions that were sent to us in advance. And then at the end, if we have time, we'll go into some live questions. So I'll start out. My name is Kevin Organichek, and I studied educational psychology. I've been a teacher, a classroom teacher, an adjunct professor, a tutor trainer, and a chief learning officer. I focus on organizational behavior and student success. And I've been doing this for about 25 years. I have a family, live in Massachusetts, and I'm a dog lover. And Robin, I'm going to let you just introduce yourself. So,
Sure. Hi, I'm Robin Sadie. I have an EDD in STEM education. I am the TPAPT Associate Director of SAT and ACT training, and I've done a lot of education leadership and coaching. I've done executive function coaching. As an adult diagnosed autistic ADHDer, I have made it my life's work to make sure that students today have more access to the accommodations and supports that they need to be successful and to be successful with less stress and anxiety overall. So today we're going to be talking about a little bit, some background about what students are going to be experiencing throughout their education, and then how we can use these experiences to direct how we approach standardized testing. Students are going to be developing their testing skills throughout their school career, starting probably even earlier than middle school. My second grader is taking math tests already. But early on, we are starting to develop the skills of communicating ideas, how to perform on academic tests, and even starting to develop the ideas of what sort of skills they'll need for future career success. As students get into high school, they're going to be more focused on developing the skills they need to do all of these things independently so that they can carry these skills with them into not only high school standardized tests, but also college tests, career certification exams, and then careers and high pressure careers. Some of these skills that we want our students to be honing in high school include time and stress management, planning and organization, both on a larger scale, how to manage a whole course load and preparing for a whole load of tests, but also how to plan and organize within a single question that has multiple steps and how to break that down and approach it. Critical thinking, problem solving, how to adjust and adapt when things aren't going the way that we think they will right away, and then how to recall information and apply that information. Testing skills are synonymous with performance skills. It's being put on the spot. It's not, do you know something or know how to do something? It's, can you do it when there's pressure, which requires a whole load of skills in addition to just the skill being tested, including working under a time limitation, dealing with the anxiety in the moment, applying a skill in a new way, adapting when things aren't as you expect them to be, recalling information under pressure. And I really like that little dumpster fire icon. But dealing with environmental issues. What if you're not in a comfortable place? What if the environment is not like the one that you've prepared and worked for and tested in? We talk a lot around here about neurodiversity and how it relates to executive function and executive dysfunction. Neurodiversity is the collection of all the different types of brains within the human population. Neurodivergent brain types, which include brains with dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, or brains with OCD, anxiety, depression, or ADHD, or autism, Asperger's. All of these different types of brains tend to have one big thing in common, and that is struggles with executive function or executive function. They show up a lot. They show up in different ways, but executive dysfunction is a common theme, and this can involve a lot of challenges like managing time and stress, planning an organization, both large scale and small scale, critical thinking, problem solving, especially under pressure, adjusting and adapting, and figuring out how to think critically and manage time and stress while adjusting and adapting, and recalling information and applying that information again while we're also trying to deal with the time and stress management.
But don't
Something
despair.
something that can make this especially frustrating but also hopeful is that a student with executive dysfunction knows what to do, they just can't get it done. And I would like to add the word yet to this. As my second grader learns in school, the power of yet. They cannot get it done yet. Many students are able to pick up a lot of these skills along the way as they go. For students who struggle with executive function, they may not be able to pick it. They may not be able to pick it up right away. They may not be able to just absorb this information and suddenly be able to do it. But with explicit instruction, with help and support, they will be able to learn these things. And these executive function skills include things like impulse control, organization, metacognition, which is thinking about thinking and evaluating whether your thoughts are moving in the right direction, whether your strategy is working, whether it's time to stop and regroup. Planning and prioritization, task initiation, starting a new task, flexible thinking, working memory, emotional control, perseverance, sticking with it when it gets tough, self-monitoring, knowing if we're doing all of these successful, and sustaining attention. And that image of the airplanes is making me really nervous here, but I see the point. There's a lot that's going on, and many students are able to pick up these skills naturally on their own easily. Many students need support developing these skills. Here are some common myths about executive functioning and our understanding of executive function. Executive function allows you to access cognition. It's not about what you know or don't know. It's about how you can access it. 65% of all learners are estimated to be impacted by executive dysfunction, and we still think that that's too low of an estimate. It's something that probably everyone has at some time or another struggled with executive dysfunction, because it's not just about innate developmental disorders. It also sometimes has to do with whether we're under an unusual amount of stress or haven't gotten enough sleep, or something else is going on. Up to 85% of success is due to soft skills, such as critical thinking and communication. These are included in executive function skills. So these skills are not just about getting a great score on the SAT or getting good grades in school, but also about how students are going to grow up and communicate with others and be able to be successful in a world that expects these skills. Executive dysfunction creeps over the years because of increased expectations and responsibility. If a student is not able to pick up these skills naturally, they're just going to get further and further behind as the expectations are increased. Just expecting more of them is not going to fix the problem. We need to address and teach these skills. Executive function has nothing to do with IQ and plays a huge role in the foundation of learning because, again, it's how you access cognition. It's not about how smart you are, but often has to do with how easily we are able to measure how smart you are. So there are many students who are so smart and capable of learning and have learned and have so much understanding and they're brilliant, but are not able to express this information, whether it's through communication or through test performance or completing task work. And that makes it so that, their grades don't represent what they know and what they can do. Kids will not outgrow executive function challenges on their own. Again, the big issue here is that for many students, it's hard to just pick up these skills. And I say that with I don't know, a bit of sarcasm in my voice because I don't understand the concept of just picking up these skills. I had to be taught them directly and explicitly, although many teachers, many school systems don't have systems in place that will necessarily teach these skills to students, and so they just sort of struggle for a while until that happens. Executive functioning challenges often come in the form of behaviors. It's hard to recognize because part of executive dysfunction is challenges with metacognition and not knowing, I don't know how to do this, or I don't know how to access this information. And so instead, we tend to lean on behaviors like avoidance, like refusing to do work, because it feels a lot more comfortable to say, I don't feel like doing this test. I don't feel like doing this, than it does to say, I can't seem to get started and my brain won't let me get started on this, even though I know I have to do it. And I feel kind of ashamed about that. So I'm just gonna avoid it, say that I don't want to, because getting in trouble for it is easier than admitting that I have this struggle getting started. Executive progress is not linear. There will be setbacks. There will also be forward progress. There will also be setbacks. That I assume will happen forever. I'm 37 and I certainly have executive function setbacks. And I assume that's probably going to continue forever. So, of course, kids with developing brains who are 14, 15, 16, 17 will certainly be facing setbacks as they go. And it takes a village. It's important to focus on the synchronicity between classroom and home, so that school and home, we can support each other's progress, support the systems in place so that our students can learn the skills that they need to be the most successful.
And I would just add that the setbacks are important because we tend to learn more from setbacks than we do from being successful. So as long as it's couched in that sort of thinking, they can be valuable and yeah, shouldn't be feared.
I appreciate you saying that. That makes my morning of executive dysfunction feel a lot better.
And mine.
Now, fortunately for us, or for those of us with children who have executive dysfunction and other related challenges, the big standardized tests, the SAT and the ACT, offer accommodations that can help our students have a better ability to show what they actually know as they are still working on and developing their executive function skills. We're going to address both tests, first the SAT and then the ACT. The SAT offers many different accommodations like extended time, most commonly 50% more time, but there's also 100% or 150% more time. Extra and extended breaks between the sections. Reading and seeing accommodations, and this list actually, sorry, it's copied and pasted a little out of date since it's all on the computer. It's going to be the digital versions of these large print text, screen readers, audio, reading the questions out loud, the ability, and then of course, everybody's using the computer for essays. A small group or private testing setting, permission for food or medication during the test, which most students are not allowed to eat or drink at all during the test, and alternative test formats similarly, but adapted to the digital test. In order to have access to these accommodations, you need a load of paperwork. But that's not surprising because anything in this area is going to involve a lot of paperwork, but it's a finite set of paperwork. It is a manageable set, and it's something that once you get it all together, the accommodations come quickly and they can make a huge difference. And so you're going to want to start thinking about how you can accumulate first a detailed diagnostic report about the disability and how it impacts test taking. You want to make sure that it's from a psychologist or medical doctor, so a licensed professional. You want to consider documentation of history of a disability, how it has been present, how it's affected the student over time, specifically as it relates to the accommodations, like how extra time has affected them in school or how not having extra time has affected them in school. And this is something that if you are just starting out, and I noticed in the poll that looks like one of the attendees has a younger elementary age student and everyone else has high school students. But even if a student is earlier on in high school and not quite at test taking time, you want to start thinking about just keeping track, just jotting down a couple of notes about how the disability has affected the student over time. Probably the most important piece of information you could have here is a current IEP or 504 plan. If a student has an accommodation in school, it's going to make it so much easier to get the accommodation on the standardized test. And for the most part, if they have an extra time accommodation in school, they are almost certainly going to get the accommodation on the SAT. No guarantees, but it is very likely very common. You want to include any previous testing or evaluations from the past. Previous standardized test results can also be used, can also be helpful here. And then any medical documentation for medical conditions, information from the doctor detailing the conditions and most importantly, how it impacts testing. Also include the information, the documentation should include the information about who is making the diagnosis and what their credentials are. Now on the ACT, the accommodations are going to be fairly similar. The ACT, which is going to be running digital tests and paper tests concurrently throughout, starting in the spring and then starting late next year, we'll be moving into only digital testing. So, similar to the SAT, a lot of the accommodations will be adapted for the digital test. ACT also offers extended time or more frequent breaks or longer breaks. Alternative test formats, again, that's going to be adjusted as the test moves increasingly towards the digital format. And then the same with the writing. Having someone read the test out loud, again, will be adapted for a digital test. Small group testing, using assistive devices. And then, and this is especially for students who have extended time testing over multiple days, if that's something that will help them have more access to test and showing what they know. Again, similar to the SAT, the ACT also requires a boatload of paperwork to get these accommodations. An official diagnosis by a licensed professional that includes information on the specific disability and how it affects the student's ability to take the test. And this is a theme that comes up a lot. It's not just about having a disability and having the diagnosis, but having official documentation about how the diagnosis is going to affect a student's ability to take a test in the standard setting and about how accommodations specifically can help them. History of school-based accommodations, again, probably the most important piece of documentation, because if a student has an IEP that allows for extended time, they are almost certainly going to get that extended time on the ACT. Any current test results that they've taken, whether it's educational tests or neuropsych evaluations, any medical reports about the disability and recommended accommodations, and evidence of past use accommodations. If a student has used the accommodations, how has this resulted their success in school on academic tests previously?
Robin, do you need all of this material in your request or
You don't necessarily need all of this material. If a student has an IEP, that is usually, if a student has an IEP that specifically allows for one of these accommodations, and the most common one is extended time, that should be sufficient. It is still helpful to have this information handy. Keep it all in a folder in case they ask for additional documentation, because that is a possibility.
right? And if they have an IEP, there's usually an underlying medical diagnosis or neuropsych exam. So there's sort of those two things are covered in an IEP, right?
Yes, that is correct. It gets more challenging when a student has an evaluation, a diagnosis, but not necessarily an IEP, especially students who tend to do pretty well, who are not problematic enough to to have access to the extra supports and don't have the IEP, that's when it gets a little bit more difficult, and you're going to want more thorough documentation to get those accommodations on the standardized test.
And also the demonstration of the use of the accommodations, because sometimes either the school doesn't have the ability to provide the accommodation, or the student has the accommodation, doesn't use it, and that somehow undermines the request for accommodations with standardized testing.
Yes, and another challenge that comes up sometimes is that if the student has already taken one of these tests and did pretty well on it, it's going to be that much harder to make the case that they need the accommodations. So try to make sure that you've sorted all of this out before they take a test.
Yeah, it's like almost like applying to college or something. Like you have to put together a portfolio and give yourself enough time in advance to do that. And that's so we've covered a little bit, and here's just a summary of the process and a general timeline. Because I guess ultimately the takeaway should be this is a process and therefore requires collection of materials, and you want to collect all your materials over time if you can, and then put it all together when you submit your request for accommodations. So now we'll say this is 4 to 6 months. Understand the eligibility and requirements, understanding the accommodations available. We told you about some of those, and most of them, in fact, but there are conceivably others that we didn't cover that your student could qualify for. You do want to review documentation requirements, particularly if you need a medical diagnosis or a neuropsych, because sometimes there's a waiting list for those things. So the sooner you get to that, the better, even if it's more than 6 months out from when you intend to use it.
And that's going
Gathering
to
the
be
doc
especially important for students who haven't done that already, because they also may benefit from accommodations in the classroom, not just on standardized tests in high school, even in college. Colleges have accommodations office too. So having that evaluation can be so helpful.
Definitely true. So gathering the documentation. So again, general time frame at 3 to 4 months out, you want to try to get everything that you need together. And if you have an IEP or a 504, hopefully that's going to be in effect for your student at the school. And you can put together a request letter, and the request letter should outline basically the evidence that supports the need for the accommodation. And those things can include the documentation from a medical professional, neuropsych exam, use of an IEP or 504, use of accommodations in the classroom, as Robin said, and how it has impacted the student's performance, or the lack of accommodations and how that may have negatively impacted performance. And then that's when you want to apply. Once you have all that stuff together, you want to apply for accommodations about 2 to 3 months before registration when possible. So you can apply for the SAT accommodations up to maybe 6 weeks before a testing date. But when you're waiting to that point where it's just 6 weeks before and you provide all the material, if you're missing one thing, that could throw you off for that test. So the sooner you can apply, the better is generally the rule here. And very often you have to go through the school's SSD department. So there's an element of coordination there with you as well. ACT is a little easier, although pre-planning along a timeline that's drawn out like this is ideal, so that you don't miss anything. You can apply for ACT accommodations up until 2 weeks, or really up until the late deadline, the late registration deadline for the exam you wish to take. And that's about 2 weeks before an exam. So I guess they're a little more lenient on the ACT side.
Generally, and this is not officially published, but what I've heard through students, through many students who have applied, through many tutors who have worked with students with disabilities, on the ACT, if you have an IEP that has an accommodation, the ACT will grant you that accommodation. The SAT is usually pretty good about it. but slightly less consistent. And then it just all becomes a little bit more challenging across the board for students who don't have IEPs or 504s that specifically mention the accommodations, especially students who are not in public schools, students who are in private schools, students who are homeschooled, and just don't have the paperwork there already because of a different school setting and you just want to make sure you have more time to accumulate all of this paperwork.
I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, just because a student is homeschooled, there is an option to request accommodations for homeschoolers as well. So don't think that if there are any homeschoolers on the call that you're left out. And then that follow-up step, it's dotting the I's and crossing the T's because ultimately you like you have to own the process because the outcome will impact you more than the person at College Board or ACT. So following up to make sure that everything is in order is definitely recommended. And
And one other thing I just wanted to add in, if uh, you may want to start off by applying for accommodations for both of the tests early on, because if one test provides accommodations for you and the other test doesn't, then they've made the decision about which test to prepare for.
ooh, brilliant. Didn't even think of that. Um, so for those of us who are visual learners, this is basically the same information on that last slide, but in a visual format. So at 4 to 5 or longer months out, gather documentation and evaluations. And again, we say longer than 4 to 5 months in case you need a neuropsych or you need a medical documentation or you're seeking medical documentation. Try and submit accommodation requests early, follow up, and make sure that all the material required has been received by the testing organization. Register with your approved accommodations and follow up to just triple check to make sure everything is in place. So we're going to shift over to some previously submitted questions. And Robin, I'll read these and you can answer. And what you can't answer, I will try to answer. So my kids know all the answers to the test, but seem to choke while taking it. Does he need accommodations?
A big hallmark of his executive function is not that students don't know things or can't do things, but they're unable to demonstrate that they have these knowledge or skills. So if a student seems to understand all the information in the content, can perform these skills, maybe not in a testing environment or maybe not when they're forced to do a really long assignment on it, but are unable to do it when it comes down to the wire, that could be an indication of an executive function challenge or a learning disability or a neurocognitive disability. And that's a good indication that you want to get an evaluation so that you can see. Because if you can get evaluated, if you can get the accommodation, then your student will have a lot more doors available, a lot more doors open to them as they get started on their standardized testing journey that will hopefully lead to more accommodations down the road as the students are developing the executive function skills on their own.
Absolutely. And this is actually something that Learnfully does is we have these sort of low stakes assessments where we can give executive function assessments to students to see if they have issues with math or dyscalculia or dyslexia or reading time. So sometimes those types of options can help you learn what you don't know yet. So help frame things out. Given we are working with neurodiverse learners, how early should we start practicing test taking skills? That's a good one.
It's never too early to start practicing test taking skills, but lest I sound like I don't know, really boring and serious person, which I'm not. There are ways to start developing these skills that are fun and awesome and that you're probably doing already and just didn't notice. Things like facilitating conversations about what a student has learned in school, being able to talk about it over the dinner table. is starting to develop the ability to communicate what they know, which is helping. Offering opportunities to perform under pressure with something a student loves, with something that is a special interest of theirs, can help them develop those skills. And with many of the students that I've tutored, they struggle with test anxiety, but they're really great at, uh, you know, pitching for their team in a playoff game. And if we can figure out how to apply their baseball under pressure skills to testing under pressure, they can realize that they have those skills already. So start practicing now, but odds are you already are.
That's a great observation. Um, okay, what path should my high schooler applying to college take? SAT, ACT, test optional? Does their diagnosis impact this decision? That's a good one.
It's a good one. That's a big one. And I could probably talk to you for the next entire half hour about this question. I will refrain. First, test optional. Test optional is a big question. I'm going to stop talking in circles and actually tell you something now. First of all, most of the top tier schools are starting to rescind their test optional policy and go back to requiring tests. With very few exceptions, however, test optional does not mean test blind. If a school says that a test is optional, that doesn't mean they don't consider a test score. So if you have two students applying to this school, let's say they're both from the same exact school, they took the same classes, same extracurriculars, same grades, but one of them has a really great test score and the other one has no test score. Which do you think they're going to pick? They're going to pick the one who has a great test score because they've demonstrated that for sure they have these skills, and it isn't just that they happen to be in easy classes or that their teachers happen to grade on a very friendly curve. And so the schools prefer these tests for the added accountability because they're standardized and are assessing all students on the same college readiness skills. Now, that doesn't mean that a student cannot get accepted if they are going test optional. And that is definitely a possibility, especially for students who still, even with accommodations, are struggling to show what they know and that their test scores are not a demonstration of their best and do not show their strengths. For many students, though, it makes sense to prepare for the test. Prepare for it, study for it, and take it because a great score can help an application. But a terrible score, you can apply a test optional to many schools still, and so that's always an option. Just better to try, better to work.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. So you can prepare for it and take a test and never release it to the school. You can wait and sort of determine if you'd like to do that. And the rule of thumb in college advising is, if you're scoring at or above the 50th percentile for whatever the school's average score range is, then it probably helps your candidacy. If not, then it doesn't. And if it doesn't, then applying test optional is a valid way to go. I have 4 kids, and one went test optional and got into a great school, like a top 10 school. And she did okay on the SAT, but not at the same level as the top 50% at that school. So anyways, don't want you to think that you can't get into a school with test optional. It's just that Robin's right. Like the other piece about SAT or ACT is most state scholarships are tied to the results, and you don't have to score in the 90th percentile to get a state scholarship usually to a school. You just have to score at or around the national average or the state average. It really varies, but you don't need to ace the test to qualify for money, and that's another big thing. The second part of this question is, does their diagnosis impact the decision of whether they should test or go test optional?
I think that a diagnosis provides additional context, but there are still likely so many students applying to all of these schools that they're going to be students with the same diagnosis that will have the test scores. So if you can have the test scores, that will help you. I also realized I kind of skipped over the SAT versus ACT part of the question. And that is going to be, it's really a personal decision. The answer to that question has changed. My answer to that question has changed significantly over the last 365 days, because the tests are changing, and that has changed the process a little bit. The SAT is at this exact moment in time, October 17th, 2024. Let's put that in the recording so I'm not quoted in a few months and it's outdated information. The SAT is a shorter test. It's 2-ish hours compared to the ACT's 3-ish hours. It is digital compared to the ACT paper version. Um, it has only short passages. It does not have a science section, although covers a lot of the same material in the other sections. Um, each question is a different scenario, a different short paragraph or couple of sentences. The ACT has it has a science section, which is actually more about data analysis than actual science content. It is longer. It is mostly offered on paper right now. And it has longer passages. So, for example, on SAT reading, you will have a paragraph, a question, next screen, a different paragraph, a different question, and so on. ACT reading, you will have one passage, maybe 500 to 750 words, and 10 questions on that passage. And there are 4 of those.
Yeah, and sometimes they're not on the same page, which is, it's stressful if you need to go back and it's more stressful if you have to go back and
Yes.
forth, you know?
Yes, that is definitely true. Now that is today. Tomorrow, or more specifically, starting in March, the ACT is offering a shorter digital version, but they have not provided a huge amount of information on how that will change the specific type of the questions. And so if your student is planning to test this spring, if your student is planning to test this spring, I would suggest taking the paper test if that is their preferred test, if they're set on the ACT. And once it goes digital, we'll see. We'll see what it looks like. The SAT, a big challenge to the SAT right now is that there are only 6 practice tests available. So for a student who really likes preparing and practicing over and over and over again, there's just not a huge amount of material. Right now, the ACT, it's a longer test. It's on paper. You have to fill in 280 little bubbles on a little piece of paper. But there are 30 or 40 valid practice tests out there. There's so much more practice material. Tutors are more confident in the material because they've been working on it. It has not changed at all in 5 or 6 years, and has not changed significantly in 10 years. And so the test is more well known. So there are really advantages and disadvantages to both. Now, how does this relate specifically to your student or to your student's diagnosis? There's a saying that I hear a lot that's if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. Your student is your student. They are not going to have the same answer to this question as everybody else. The SAT is better for students who struggle to retain information throughout a learned passage and carry that through a bunch of questions, who struggle with pushing through a really long and boring piece of text, who struggle with a lot of visual interpretation of data on the ACT science section. And also timing. I didn't mention timing. The ACT, even though it's longer, it's faster. There are many, many more questions. The time crunch is a big part of it. Separate from accommodations and additional time. That's sort of a different story. The SAT is a little bit more leisurely. If a student has extended time, the ACT offers that bit of advantage because timing is such a big part of the challenge that if they have a little more leeway to show what they know and show their strengths, that could be an advantage. Completely lost my train of thought and forgot where I was going.
Timing on ACT. So ACT, longer test, shorter time per question. SAT, shorter test, longer time per question. ACT, the English and reading are denser. Like if you're a good
Yes.
reader, the ACT, like if you're a fast reader
Yes.
and
You're
you're
a good,
good
yeah.
with reading comprehension, the ACT could be a good test for you, especially if you're
Yes.
not great at math, because only a quarter of it counts towards your final score versus the SAT, which half of it is based on a math score, half of it is based on a reading and writing score. So anyways,
Yes, yes. But on the other hand, the SAT is more of a challenge for students who struggle with changing gears and changing topic more often because each question is on a different topic. It's not one passage that's going to get you through 10 questions. And then an additional challenge that students might find not only like how long the passages are, how much they're changing gears, it's also going to be calculator usage on the math section. While both tests allow for the calculator the entire time, the SAT currently allows usage of um, a web-based graphing calculator that is a lot easier to use than the students' handheld graphing calculators. It has a lot more functionality. And so SAT math is a lot more how to use the calculator to solve these problems. ACT math involves a little bit more math content knowledge and understanding because you're limited to a handheld graphing calculator.
one thing I want to bring up in relation to this is I've done a lot of these presentations over the years, and inevitably someone asks or someone says, "Hey, I've heard you're not supposed to uh, release the fact that you took a test with accommodations," and so people don't they don't request accommodations for testing as a result of that, and so that's just absolutely wrong. It's another thing we need to debunk. Like, you want to be able to perform at the highest level if you decide to take one of these tests or both of these tests. And to do so, you should have all of the same opportunity that anyone else would have. So I want to make sure and address that. Uh, okay, so what if my kid's performance varies based on question type? Or why does my kid's performance vary based on question type?
This is a really great question, and that is because not only is it about what content the students do or don't know, but the different sorts of questions, the different types of questions on both of the different tests are going to require different amounts of executive function to to read, to interpret, to process the question, to decide on a course of action, to implement the course of action, to evaluate along the way whether this course of action is successful, to decide when it's time to change strategies, to cover all the details so you haven't lost anything, and then to be able to circle the right answer choice when it comes down to it. Different questions involve different degrees of that. And so that is why student performance can vary. Now, if you have noticed that your students' performance is varied based on the question type, you've basically done half of my job already, and you already know exactly where they need to work and what they need to work on. And that's what we do, is we figure out what specifically type of question are they struggling with, and so that we can use our experience and say, okay, this type of question uses this sort of cognitive skill, this ability, this executive functioning skill. And so here's how we can work on this skill that will help you with this type of question, and we can get the most leverage out of that instruction.
Great point. What types of tests should my high schooler be ready for?
All of them?
Well, you've got your
Um,
like classroom-based tests, and you've got your state graduation requirements, and possibly SAT, ACT, right? What else?
there are basically those two types of tests. There are school academic tests and there are standardized tests. Academic tests, and both require different skills and different executive function skills. Classroom tests are going to require a better understanding of the student's teacher. Since they're not standardized, there's a lot of leeway that a teacher has in making them. They're often written by the teacher, and so they very much are going to test what the teacher wants to test, what the teacher finds important. So a lot of preparing for school tests is learning to look at class notes, to look at maybe past year's tests if you have access to them, or look at previous tests in the year, or look at quizzes or homework assignments, and be able to say, oh, I think my teacher finds this stuff really important. I need to make sure to know this. The teacher underlined this, circled this, and being able to interpret the teacher's nonverbal communication to help you figure out and prioritize what to learn. The standardized tests, they are standardized. That doesn't mean that they are necessarily perfectly objective, but they are remarkably consistent from test to test to test. So, you know, and this is something I tell my students all the time. I'm not good at these tests because I'm good at these tests or because I'm really smart. I'm good at these tests because I know these tests really well. And I'm very rarely, if ever, surprised on an SAT or ACT because I know pretty much every kind of question that they can provide. And so it's a different skill that learning for academic tests and learning for school, but it is a skill. It is a finite skill that can be learned and developed. And so you want your student to be approaching both of those kinds of tests and developing the skills for both of them.
Okay.
What type of test should sorry, I got ahead of myself. I'm too excited.
No, that's okay. But it's the same question, but for middle schoolers. What tests should middle schoolers prepare for? And when I think of that, I think of the middle school tests that qualify you for high schools like SSAT, ISEE, HSPT tests, but I don't know of others.
There are also going to be state standardized tests. Almost every state requires students
Oh
to
yeah.
take tests on a somewhat annual basis, starting from about second or third grade, usually in math and literacy. Sometimes they throw in some science there periodically. These tests are very similar to the SAT and ACT in terms of how they are standardized and what sort of topics they cover. They're usually, at least in my experience, teaching in a couple of different states, they're usually a little bit less well written and so a little bit less predictable. But by helping students prepare for these standardized tests, you're actually helping them prepare for the SAT and ACT because they're starting to develop those skills of what do we do when there's a time limit? What do we do when we have to fill out bubbles for hours and hours and hours? Although hopefully that is going to be defunct soon enough. You know, what do we do when we're being tested on stuff that looks different than we saw in school? And how do we figure out what they're asking us, even though it's not the usual assignment that I have for my teachers? And so preparing for these tests is actually ways to help our students develop their skills and develop confidence in testing that can actually make these tests a lot less intimidating and a lot less overwhelming.
You know, and just to dovetail, you can also apply for accommodations for these tests. In fact, if you're doing that earlier on in your student's academic, I guess, life cycle, then collecting the materials later, if you need them for SAT or ACT, you already have sort of a roadmap for that. Okay, are digital tests or paper tests better for my learner? Whether diagnosed, undiagnosed, doesn't matter. So
If you've met one student with a learning disability, you've met one student with a learning disability. Every student, even with the same exact diagnosis, is going to have a different strength and weakness. You're going to want to consider what works best for them. Digital tests are, and I'm sure my parents never expected I would say something like this. Digital tests are in a format that students are more comfortable with. Kids have grown up, many of them looking at screens, working with screens. But often in a way that makes it a little more exciting. And that little more exciting can actually help stimulate the executive function because it tricks the brain into thinking that it's important when otherwise they would find it boring. And so digital tests can actually be really helpful for engaging students. The digital tests also tend to be a little bit shorter as they appear right now in this current iteration. On the other hand, paper tests can allow students who are more who benefit more from engaging tactilely with the content. It helps them touch it. It helps them underline and circle things that even though the digital tests have an annotation function that allow you to underline and highlight text, it doesn't feel the same as actually circling it with your hands, actually being able to physically move up and down the page. Digital tests show you one question at a time, at least the SAT does. You see one question at a time, and so it's a little bit less overwhelming. But on the ACT, you can actually physically see progress as you move down the page on the move through the paper. So really advantages, disadvantages, they're all going to appeal to different facets of executive function. Of course, all skills we can work on. So if there's a test that is better for your student in most ways, but there's still one big downside to it, you can work on developing that particular skill and prioritize that while the test is otherwise appealing to their other strengths.
Yeah, and incidentally,
Does it matter? Well, it does. First of all, it doesn't matter if it's diagnosed or undiagnosed. That doesn't change your student and what their strengths and weaknesses and skills are, whether they've had a doctor sign off on it or not. Does it matter which test they take, digital or paper? Whatever your student is going to do the best on. But also considering that the paper tests are better known and have more practice materials for them compared to the digital tests at this time, but that is just one among many one of many considerations.
I feel like you're just straddling the middle.
Yes,
But I
I
think
absolutely
you basically,
straddle.
like you said, whichever tests they do better on, whichever way they perform at a higher level or feel more comfortable, right? So is
Yeah,
that the
and I would, if, yeah, I'm not gonna pick a side. If a student is planning to do months and months and months of prep for a test, pick up the paper ACT because there's more practice material. If a student is going to do less practice, pick the SAT because it's shorter. But really, again, it depends on the student. Actually, what a student should do is first apply for accommodations for both of them before you even sit down for the test. And then if you get accommodations on both, take both of them
with
one
the
time
accommodations?
with the accommodations. See how you do, see which one sounds less terrible to practice over and over again.
Less terrible. And so that's another, we have assessments for this. So if folks are interested, you can contact me after, but we do assess for SAT versus ACT, and we have assessments for the digital SAT test as well. What can I do if the school or institution does not provide the accommodations needed for my kid?
Start collecting documentation, start documenting, write down everything, write down why you think your kid needs the accommodations. Try and get a psychologist or a medical professional to back you up on those accommodations because sometimes a school, especially a private school that does not have the same legal requirements as a public school, may not provide the accommodations even though they would be beneficial to a student. If you can get an official report from a psychologist that says student would benefit from these accommodations. If you can document the challenges the student has had without the accommodations, you have a better chance of getting the accommodations on the standardized test. But start documenting as soon as you can.
Yeah, this may be one of the more important questions for schools that are either under-resourced or don't have the same requirements. Collecting and documenting as early as possible, even well beyond that 6 months before you want to request an accommodation for SAT or ACT, but earlier on in the academic journey, that's ideal.
There's also a difference between school doesn't provide the accommodation because they don't think the student needs the accommodation, and schools don't provide the accommodation because they don't have the resources or because the student has refused them or even though it's in an IEP, it's just not happening because the school has a million other things going on at that time. And those are gonna offer different challenges to getting the accommodations on these tests.
Here we go. Here's one about test anxiety. My kid gets highly anxious about tests, but I does not have a diagnosis. Can they get accommodations, and what can be done to support them?
The answer to this is twofold. First, start documenting and get an evaluation because that's a place to start. It's up to a medical professional to provide an official diagnosis, and the results of that can determine where you go from there for accommodations. as whether they qualify for accommodations or not, or get approved for accommodations or not. Now, as for what you can do to support them is really an entirely different question. You're going to want to support students, even if they get accommodations, they still require support. And that is, how do we learn about test anxiety? How can we help our student figure out what's going to help them first identify when test anxiety is happening and when they're not performing optimally, and then learn strategies for fixing it, both long-term stress management, long-term anxiety management, but also for nipping it in the moment when a student is struggling with anxiety in the middle of the test. Regardless of whether a student gets accommodations, these are important skills for a student to learn, recognizing their feelings, their emotions, and being able to manage them in real time. Even if a student is given extra time for anxiety, that's not going to fix the anxiety. Learning to manage it is really helpful. And not to discount the value of medication too. That is a thing that is hugely helpful and has nothing to do with whether a student does or doesn't get accommodations and whether we support them or not.
Good point.
That I believe the participants can contribute to.
Yeah, it looks like it's under the More tab. Q&A. I can't do it because I'm on the panel, but you can ask questions that way as well. And if you cannot ask questions, but you have questions, please email us at contact@learnfully.com. You can put subject testing assessment. As I said, we do the EF assessments and standardized testing assessments. But if you have just general questions, we can answer. It's fine to use this same email box. And you can find us on social. So follow us. Stay attuned to our articles on neurodivergence and successful learning strategies. Okay, well, Robin, I want to thank you for an excellent presentation, and
Thank you so much for having me.
it's great learning more about accommodations. Everyone, thank you for joining us. And as I said, if you need to get in touch with us, please email and we'll get back in touch with you quickly. Take care, everyone.